The sound of tearing paper sliced through the terminal like a thunderclap. Elijah Carter's first-class ticket, ripped in half, discarded like it was nothing. A stunned silence rippled through the crowd, gasps muffled behind clasped hands and wide-eyed disbelief. Madison Clark, the flight attendant, stood rigid, her jaw set, as if daring him to challenge her. "There must be some kind of mistake," she said, her voice clipped, controlled. "This ticket can't be right. You'll need to step aside." Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. He simply let the moment stretch, let the weight of what had just happened settle into the uneasy hush around them. Then, with the practiced patience of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, he spoke. "Are you sure about that?" Madison scoffed. "Sir, I don't make mistakes." A slow, knowing smile curled at the edge of Elijah's lips. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A single tap, a single call, and then, "Mr. Carter," a voice called from behind. A man in a sharply pressed suit, the airline's regional director, pushed through the gathered crowd, his face pale as recognition dawned. Madison's confidence faltered. "Sir, she stammered. But it was too late. The room was watching, the cameras were rolling, and Elijah Carter, the man she had just tried to erase, owned the very airline she worked for. But before we dive deeper into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and if you love stories of justice served, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. JFK Airport pulsed with energy. A symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant announcements crackling over the loudspeakers. Business travelers in crisp suits typed furiously on laptops. Families wrangled restless children, and exhausted tourists slumped against their carry-ons, waiting for a flight that would carry them to another city, another time zone, another chapter of their lives. Elijah Carter moved through the chaos with quiet confidence, his sharp eyes scanning the departure boards as he adjusted the sleek leather duffel slung over his shoulder. He wasn't in a rush. He had mastered the art of efficiency, knowing exactly how much time he needed to clear security, check in, and make it to the gate without unnecessary stress. He had been on more flights than he could count, but this trip to Los Angeles felt different. It wasn't just another business meeting, it was a defining moment, the final step in acquiring a company that would expand his empire, cementing him as one of the most powerful black businessmen in the country. Yet, as he walked through the terminal, he could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift in body language. The way someone would glance at his tailored but understated suit, then at his skin, their minds struggling to reconcile the two. It was a feeling he knew well, one he had carried since childhood, through every stage of his life, no matter how much success he achieved. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, Elijah had learned early that the world didn't hand out opportunities to people like him. His mother had worked 2 jobs, her hands rough from years of cleaning houses she'd never be invited to live in, while his father had disappeared before he was old enough to form a memory of him. He had spent his teenage years watching friends get swallowed up by the streets. Good kids who were smart, funny, and full of potential, but who had been labeled as trouble before they had a chance to prove otherwise. He had decided early on that he wouldn't be one of them. He had poured himself into school, working shifts at a grocery store to help his mother with the bills, taking on every extra credit assignment he could just to keep himself ahead. When he got into Wharton on a full scholarship, his high school principal had shaken his hand with pride, but the look in some of his teachers' eyes had said something else. "Surprised you made it out, huh?" Even after he built his investment firm from the ground up, turning a single real estate deal into a multi-million-dollar portfolio, there were always people who acted like he didn't belong. He had seen it in the way bank executives had hesitated before approving his loans, in the way other CEOs had spoken over him in meetings, assuming he was just another wealthy athlete instead of the man making the deals. But he never let it shake him. He played the long game, learning when to let people underestimate him and when to remind them exactly who he was. Today, he wasn't interested in reminding anyone of anything. He just wanted to board his flight, settle into his first-class seat, and prepare for the meeting that would change everything. He pulled his ticket from his pocket, running his thumb over the embossed lettering. First class. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of every sleepless night, every battle fought in boardrooms where he had been the only black man in the room. Every time he had to prove himself twice over just to get what others took for granted. To most people, a first-class ticket was just a luxury, a comfortable seat with better food and extra legroom. But for Elijah, it was something more. It was a symbol, a silent testament to the years of struggle, the choices that had led him here, the sacrifices that had been worth it. He adjusted his watch and exhaled slowly, pushing aside the creeping frustration that always came with these moments. He knew what was coming. The glances, the assumptions, the need to explain himself in spaces where people still expected him to justify why he was there. It didn't matter how many zeros were in his bank account or how many deals he had closed, there would always be someone who saw his skin first and his success second. But that was fine. He had spent his whole life defying expectations, and today would be no different. Madison Clark had been working at the airline for nearly a decade, and in that time she had developed a keen sense of who did and didn't belong in first class. It wasn't something she could always articulate, but she trusted her instincts. First class was for executives in tailored suits, for wealthy couples headed to luxury vacations, for socialites with designer luggage and effortless entitlement. It wasn't for people like him. The moment she spotted Elijah Carter in the first-class line, something in her stiffened. She couldn't explain it, not in a way that would sound reasonable if spoken aloud, but it was there, a reflex, a certainty buried in her gut. There's no way he's first class. Maybe an athlete, maybe some record label executive who got lucky, but not the type who actually belonged. As he approached the counter, she forced her lips into a polite but tight smile, her professional mask slipping slightly as she reached for his ticket. The expectation was clear in her mind. Any second now, she would inform him that this was the first-class line and he would realize his mistake, mumble an apology, and step aside. She had seen it before. People assuming they could cut the line, thinking they could talk their way into an upgrade they hadn't paid for. But as she glanced down at the ticket in her hand, something in her tensed. The seat assignment was clear, first class, paid in full. Yet instead of handing it back and letting him through, she hesitated, her grip tightening around the paper. There had to be a mistake. Elijah caught the flicker of hesitation in her face. He had seen it before. The pause, the tightening of the lips, the silent battle in someone's head as they tried to make sense of what was in front of them. His name on a first-class ticket didn't fit the story she had already written in her mind. He was used to these moments, had spent years perfecting how to navigate them without letting the irritation seep through. He kept his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, waiting for her to process what was already clear. But instead of handing him the ticket back, she did something he hadn't anticipated. She ripped it in half. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like a gavel coming down in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. A small collective gasp rippled through the passengers in line behind him. For a moment, time seemed to slow, the torn pieces of the ticket fluttering slightly in her grip before she let them drop onto the counter. The finality of it was staggering. It wasn't just an assumption anymore. It was a statement, a declaration that no matter what that ticket said, she had already decided that he did not belong. Madison met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that suggested she was daring him to challenge her. "There must be some kind of mistake," she said, her voice clipped, professional but with an unmistakable edge. "This ticket can't be right. You'll need to step aside." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He glanced down at the torn ticket, his mind catching up to what had just happened, to the sheer audacity of it. He had encountered prejudice before, had dealt with the subtle dismissals, the barely concealed disbelief, but this was something else. This was an erasure, a denial so blatant it left him momentarily stunned. Around him, he could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others watched with growing unease. A few had their phones out, already recording, sensing that something was about to unfold. He exhaled slowly, forcing down the immediate reaction clawing at his chest. Anger wouldn't serve him here. He knew exactly how this would be spun if he raised his voice, if he allowed the frustration to seep into his tone. He could already hear the murmurs, aggressive, difficult, overreacting. He had spent his entire career proving that he was more than the assumptions placed on him, that he could command a room without ever having to raise his voice. This would be no different. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Why did you just do that?" Madison lifted her chin slightly, still holding on to the thin veil of authority she thought she had over the situation. "Sir, I need you to step aside. You can take this up with customer service." He let a pause stretch between them, watching as she shifted slightly under his gaze. He could push harder. He could demand a manager, could lay out exactly why what she had just done wasn't just wrong but entirely unacceptable. But he didn't need to push. The moment was already slipping out of her control. A voice from behind him cut through the tense silence. That wasn't right. He turned slightly, catching sight of a young woman holding up her phone, her camera still recording. Sophia. He didn't know her, but in that moment she was exactly what he needed. Another passenger chimed in. "She tore up his ticket for no reason." Madison's expression flickered, something between annoyance and discomfort. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to step aside, to accept her decision, to shrink under the weight of the quiet humiliation. Instead, the crowd was watching, judging, recording. Elijah finally nodded, his voice steady. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." Madison's lips thinned, but before she could respond, another uniformed employee was already making his way over, his expression one of concern as he took in the scene. The power was shifting. She could feel it, and for the first time, Madison felt the cold grip of uncertainty settle in her chest. Sophia tightened her grip on her phone, her camera still rolling, her heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. She had covered protests, political events, moments of public outrage, but she had never expected to capture something like this at an airport. The injustice was so blatant, so brazen, that she couldn't let it go unnoticed. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the hushed tension. "Why did you just tear up his ticket?" A few passengers turned toward her, their expressions shifting from passive curiosity to active engagement. An older man in a navy blazer muttered, "Yeah, that was uncalled for." A woman holding a toddler on her hip whispered to her husband, shaking her head. The murmurs grew, voices overlapping, passengers glancing between Elijah and Madison, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Madison's grip on control was slipping, and she knew it. Her eyes darted between Elijah, the growing crowd, and Sophia's phone, the red recording light blinking like a warning sign. "This isn't a big deal," she said sharply, but there was an edge of unease creeping into her voice. "I thought there was a mistake, that's all. He can go to customer service and get it sorted." "A mistake?" Sophia scoffed, stepping closer, making sure the camera caught every detail. "So your first instinct was to rip up his ticket instead of scanning it like you do for everyone else?" "That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice." Elijah remained silent, watching the scene unfold, knowing that the weight of public opinion was shifting in his favor. He could feel it in the way people were starting to step forward instead of away, in the quiet outrage simmering beneath the surface. Someone behind him muttered, "That was discrimination, plain and simple." Before Madison could respond, a voice cut through the growing noise. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly as a tall man in a Navy Airline uniform strode toward them, his expression a mix of concern and authority. James Reynolds had been a supervisor for over 15 years, had dealt with everything from irate passengers to last-minute cancellations, but the tension in the air told him this was something different. He glanced at Madison first, noting the stiffness in her posture, the way she looked almost trapped. Then his eyes moved to Elijah, calm but unyielding, and finally to the phone screen still recording. Madison spoke up first, her voice a little too quick, a little too defensive. "Sir, there was an issue with his ticket. I was just trying to follow protocol." Reynolds frowned. "What kind of issue?" Elijah met his gaze, holding up the torn pieces of his ticket. His voice was controlled, precise. "This is the problem. Reynolds inhaled sharply, taking the ripped ticket from Elijah's hands, examining it for a long moment before looking at Madison. "Did you do this?" Madison hesitated, her jaw tightening. I thought it was fake or a mistake. I was just trying to—" "You tore up a passenger's ticket without verification." Reynolds' voice dropped, low and firm. "I assume that was your mistake." A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the passengers. Some shook their heads, others exchanged knowing glances. It was obvious now. The excuses weren't enough. The truth was staring them all in the face. Madison's pulse was pounding in her ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had expected compliance, not resistance. She had expected Elijah to step aside, not stand his ground. And she had certainly not expected a crowd full of people turning against her. She could feel their stares, their silent judgment, the knowledge that this moment was spiraling beyond her control. Reynolds straightened, clearing his throat before speaking again. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for this." His eyes flicked back to Madison, a silent warning flashing through them. "I'll make sure this is corrected immediately. We will reissue your ticket right now." Elijah nodded, accepting the apology without a word, but his gaze never left Madison. Her face had paled, her once authoritative stance faltering. The realization was sinking in. This wasn't going to be brushed aside. She was the one being scrutinized now. The passengers continued to murmur as Reynolds gestured for another attendant to handle Elijah's reissued ticket. But Madison's hands were trembling slightly, her stomach twisting as she saw Sophia still recording, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a boulder. For the first time, she felt the sharp sting of what it meant to be on the other side of power. A ripple of tension spread through the crowd as two TSA officers approached, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his stance exuding quiet authority, while the other was shorter but stockier, his eyes already scanning Elijah as if assessing a potential threat. They hadn't even spoken yet, but Elijah knew how this was going to go. He had seen it before, felt it in a dozen different ways throughout his life, the unspoken understanding that no matter how calm he was, no matter how controlled, he was already guilty in their eyes. Madison let out a slow breath, her posture shifting from tense to smug as she crossed her arms. She had been feeling the weight of judgment from the crowd, but now, with security stepping in, she felt herself regaining control. She didn't even have to say anything. The moment the officers arrived, the power shifted back into her hands. She tilted her chin up slightly, glancing at Elijah with the kind of silent triumph that made his blood run hot. The taller officer, a white man with close-cropped blonde hair, stopped just in front of Elijah, keeping his hand casually near his utility belt. "Is there a problem here?" His tone was neutral, but the way his gaze locked onto Elijah made it clear who he thought the problem was. Before Elijah could speak, Madison jumped in, her voice clipped and professional, the practiced tone of someone who knew how to frame a situation in her favor. "There was an issue with his ticket," she said, her words deliberate, careful not to sound overtly accusatory but planting the seed of doubt anyway. "I tried to handle it, but he's refusing to cooperate." Refusing to cooperate. The phrase landed like a stone in Elijah's chest. He knew exactly what it meant in moments like these, knew how quickly things could spiral if he didn't play this just right. Around them, the murmurs had grown quieter, the onlookers holding their breath as if watching something unfold in slow motion. The stockier officer, a black man with a skeptical gaze, frowned slightly but didn't speak. The taller officer, however, squared his shoulders. "Sir, I need you to step aside so we can resolve this." Elijah inhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. He could feel the weight of every choice pressing down on him. If he argued, if he so much as hesitated, this would turn into non-compliance. If he refused to step aside, it would become obstruction. And if either officer decided he looked aggressive, this could escalate into something far worse. But he wasn't going to let them frame him as the problem. His voice was measured when he spoke. "I don't believe I'm the one who needs to step aside. My ticket was torn up in front of multiple witnesses, and the airline supervisor has already acknowledged the mistake. I have done nothing wrong." The taller officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm asking you to step aside." Elijah held his ground, keeping his voice steady. "And I'm asking why I'm the one being asked to move when I haven't done anything to warrant it. If you're here to ensure order, then maybe you should be asking her why she destroyed my ticket." The stockier officer glanced at Madison, then at Reynolds, who was still standing nearby, lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't saying anything, and that silence was damning. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "I have video of everything." Sophia stepped forward, her phone still held high, her expression unwavering. "I recorded her tearing up his ticket. I recorded her lying about him refusing to cooperate. If you're about to make this man step aside when he's the victim here, then I hope you don't mind all of America watching." The taller officer hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. The shift was subtle, barely perceptible, but Elijah saw it. The flicker of uncertainty, the realization that this was bigger than just an airport dispute. The power was tilting again. Madison's confidence faltered, her arms dropping to her sides as she shot Sophia a glare. But the damage was done. The stockier officer exhaled and turned to Reynolds. "Is that true?" Reynolds, finally backed into a corner, nodded stiffly. "Yes," he admitted. "Mr. Carter's ticket was legitimate. It never should have been destroyed." The taller officer took a step back. Tension still coiled in his frame, but the threat was gone. "In that case, we'll let the airline handle it," he said, his voice suddenly distant, as if he wanted nothing more than to extract himself from this mess. "Sorry for the misunderstanding." Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. He just let the moment hang in the air. Let Madison feel what it was like to be the one standing in the center of the storm, and as the officers walked away, as the crowd let out the breath it had been holding, he saw something flicker across Madison's face. Realization, fear, the slow, sinking awareness that she had just made a mistake she couldn't take back. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears as the officers took a step closer, their posture rigid, their eyes locked onto him like he was a threat. He had seen this before, on the news, in stories passed down from friends, in warnings from his mother when he was a teenager about how to behave if he was ever stopped by police. Don't make any sudden movements, keep your hands visible, stay calm no matter how wrong they are. The weight of those lessons pressed down on him now, heavy as chains. He could see how this could unfold, how a few wrong words or a single misinterpreted gesture could turn him from an airline passenger into a headline. He thought of the names, men like him who had been accused, detained, beaten, some never making it home. He thought of the way the world was quick to believe a black man was dangerous before they ever considered the possibility that he was the one being wronged. He flexed his fingers, unclenching his fists before anyone could mistake the tension in his body for aggression. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until a voice shattered it. He didn't do anything wrong. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stepped forward, his face red with frustration. That flight attendant destroyed his ticket in front of all of us, and now you're treating him like the problem? "Yeah, I saw it too," another voice called out, this time from a young black woman near the gate. "She didn't even scan it, just ripped it up and acted like he wasn't supposed to be here." More voices joined in, some outraged, others uncertain but unwilling to stay silent. The tension in the air shifted again, the crowd pressing in slightly, the collective weight of their presence forcing the officers to hesitate. Sophia kept her phone steady, her voice unwavering. "This is all on video. If you touch him without cause, you'll be explaining it to millions of people by tomorrow morning." Elijah saw the flicker of hesitation in the taller officer's eyes. He saw the way they both started to recalculate, reassess. The situation had changed. This wasn't just an easy removal anymore. This was something bigger, something public, the kind of thing that could ruin careers if handled wrong. Before the officers could respond, Reynolds took a step forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "That's enough," he said, his tone firm, final. "There's no reason for TSA to be involved here. Mr. Carter has done nothing wrong, and I won't have this situation escalate any further." The stockier officer glanced at Reynolds, then back at Madison, who had gone stiff, her expression flickering between disbelief and panic. Reynolds turned to her, his voice sharper now, "Madison, step away from the counter, right now." She opened her mouth, then shut it, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the moment. Her gaze darted from Reynolds to Elijah to the recording phones, capturing every second of her downfall. The arrogance that had been so evident before was gone, replaced by something else. Fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of what would happen when this video hit the internet. Fear that, for the first time, she wouldn't be the one in control of the narrative. Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, letting her feel what it was like to be the one who didn't belong. The air in the terminal was thick with tension, a charged silence stretching as passengers, staff, and security stood frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Elijah slowly adjusted his cuffs, his movements deliberate, controlled. The fire burning in his chest was tempered by years of knowing exactly when to speak, when to let silence work in his favor, and when to drop a hammer so heavy that no one could ignore it. He turned to Reynolds, his voice even, his posture relaxed but commanding. "I'll need the contact information for your corporate office." The request was so calm, so measured, that it took a second for Reynolds to react. The supervisor blinked, his hands still clenched at his sides, his mind racing through possible next steps. Madison, standing stiffly beside him, looked like she had just regained a sliver of hope, her arms crossing over her chest as she exhaled. Reynolds hesitated. "Sir, may I ask why?" Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "Because I own a significant stake in this airline, and this isn't over." The moment the words left his mouth, the entire atmosphere of the terminal shifted. It was like the oxygen had been sucked from the room, replaced with a stunned, suffocating stillness. Madison's smugness evaporated instantly, her mouth parting slightly in shock as the meaning of Elijah's words sank in. She had spent the last 10 minutes trying to erase him, to reduce him to someone whose presence in first class was an impossibility. But now, in a single sentence, he had flipped the script. He wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just another black man she could dismiss with a sneer and a torn ticket. He was a part owner of the very airline she worked for. The murmur started again, this time louder, more pointed. A few passengers gasped outright. The man in the gray suit let out something between a laugh and a scoff, shaking his head. Sophia's camera zoomed in on Madison, who looked as if she had been physically struck. Reynolds cleared his throat, straightening his tie. His expression shifted, no longer just that of an airline employee trying to manage a situation, but of a man realizing he was standing in the middle of a career-altering disaster. I see," he said carefully. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for—" "Don't apologize to me," Elijah cut him off, his tone unreadable. "Not yet." Madison finally found her voice, though it was weaker now, lacking the sharp-edged authority she had wielded so freely before. I didn't know," she stammered, as if that somehow excused everything. Elijah let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, tilting his head slightly. "You didn't ask." Her face drained of color completely, the full weight of what she had done settling on her like a crushing force. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a career-ending miscalculation. She had torn up the ticket of a shareholder, had humiliated a man who had the power to do far more than just file a complaint, and worst of all, she had done it in front of an audience that would ensure the entire world knew about it. Reynolds turned sharply toward the other attendants. "Issue Mr. Carter a new ticket immediately, first class." His voice was clipped, urgent. He knew they were beyond saving face, but at the very least he needed to act fast. "And make sure it's handled properly." One of the attendants, a younger woman who had been standing frozen behind the desk, nearly tripped over herself as she rushed to the computer. Madison, however, remained planted in place, her eyes darting between Elijah, Reynolds, and the growing crowd. Elijah took a step closer to her, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "You tore up more than just a ticket today," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "You tore up your assumptions. You tore up your own future. And you didn't even see it coming." Madison's breath hitched, her fingers twitching at her sides. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to claw back even an ounce of the control she had once held over this moment. But there was nothing left to say. The younger attendant hesitantly held out the new first-class ticket, her hands shaking slightly. Elijah took it without a word, glancing down at the fresh print before sliding it neatly into his jacket pocket. Reynolds cleared his throat again, glancing toward security, who were now looking at Madison with something close to sympathy, realizing that she, not Elijah, was the one whose job was now hanging in the balance. Elijah exhaled, taking a final look around. The recording phones, the stunned faces, the knowledge that before the night was over, this moment would be shared, dissected, and spread to millions. He had spent his entire career proving people like Madison wrong. Today was just another reminder of why he would never stop. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the boarding gate, leaving Madison standing in the wreckage of the moment she had created for herself. Elijah was barely settled into his first-class seat when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was unmistakable. Corporate headquarters. He let it ring twice before answering, his voice steady. "This is Elijah Carter." A brief pause. Then a smooth, carefully measured voice came through the line. "Mr. Carter, this is Mark Bennett, CEO of Atlantic Airways. I understand you had an incident at JFK earlier today." Elijah smirked slightly, watching the flight attendants move through the cabin, all suddenly more attentive than usual. "An incident. That's one way to put it," he said, leaning back against the plush leather. "Another way would be to call it what it was: discrimination. Public, humiliating, and now very, very visible." Bennett exhaled on the other end, the kind of controlled breath a man takes when he knows he's walking into a conversation where he has no leverage. "Mr. Carter, let me start by saying that what happened today was completely unacceptable. I want to personally apologize." "I'm not interested in apologies," Elijah cut in, his voice cool but firm. "Not yet. What I'm interested in is what you plan to do about it." Another pause, longer this time. Bennett wasn't an idiot. He had seen the videos circulating online, had received the frantic calls from PR, from legal, from board members already worried about the fallout. Elijah wasn't just another passenger with a complaint. He was someone with power, someone who, if he wanted to, could turn this into a crisis the airline might not recover from. "I understand your frustration," Bennett finally said, his voice tighter now. "Believe me, I do. We're already reviewing the incident internally, and I assure you disciplinary action will be taken against the employee in question." Elijah let the words sit for a moment, then chuckled softly. "You think firing one flight attendant is going to fix this?" Bennett hesitated. "What do you suggest?" Elijah's grip on his phone tightened slightly. He had spent years sitting in meetings just like this, where men like Bennett measured their words carefully, trying to find the path of least resistance. But this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been treated like they didn't belong, about a culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked. "I'll tell you exactly what I suggest," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something undeniable. "And you're going to listen." Elijah walked into the glass-walled conference room with the same calm confidence he carried into every high-stakes negotiation. The room was sleek, modern, and sterile, the kind of space designed to exude power, but right now, the power didn't belong to the men and women sitting at the long mahogany table. It belonged to him. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their postures stiff, their expressions carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in their eyes. They knew exactly why he was here. Mark Bennett stood as Elijah entered, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Carter, thank you for taking the time to meet with us." Elijah didn't return the smile. He took his time pulling out a chair, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them sweat before he finally spoke. "Let's not waste time. We both know what this is. You're not here because you suddenly care about discrimination. You're here because you got caught, because there are millions of eyes on you right now, waiting to see how you handle this." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably. Bennett cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I won't deny that the situation at JFK was unacceptable. The employee involved." "Stop," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp. "If you think firing one flight attendant is going to make this go away, you're not as smart as I thought." Bennett blinked, caught off guard. A younger executive, a woman seated near the end of the table, hesitated before speaking. "What do you propose?" Elijah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his voice steady. "Real change. Not a PR stunt, not a weak apology buried in some press release. I want a full commitment, mandatory bias training for every employee, from the ground crew to the C-suite, stronger hiring practices that actually prioritize diversity instead of just checking boxes, a zero-tolerance policy for racial discrimination with real consequences." Bennett exchanged glances with his legal team, clearly calculating how much damage control they could afford. That's a significant overhaul," he said carefully. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "It should be." Another silence, heavier this time. The executives looked at one another, waiting for someone to push back, but no one did. They all knew the truth. Elijah wasn't making a request, he was setting terms. Bennett exhaled, pressing his lips together before nodding. "We can implement those changes, but we'll need time to—" "You don't have time," Elijah cut in. "The longer you wait, the worse this gets for you. People are already talking, the videos are spreading. Every hour you hesitate is another hour your airline's reputation burns." Bennett rubbed his temple, finally looking at his team before nodding. "All right, we'll do it, but I want you involved. If we're making these changes, I want your insight." Elijah considered it for a moment before nodding. "Fine. But this isn't about me. This is about setting a precedent. So here's what's going to happen next. You're going to issue a public statement, not a sugar-coated, carefully worded non-apology. You're going to own this, completely." Bennett swallowed hard, knowing he had no other choice. Hours later, the airline's official social media channels lit up with the statement. It was direct, clear, and unmistakably different from the usual corporate damage control. "We failed. An incident at JFK exposed a flaw in our company's culture that we can no longer ignore. We are taking full responsibility, and effective immediately, we are implementing a company-wide initiative to address systemic bias within our organization. Our employees will undergo mandatory training, and we will work with experts, including Mr. Carter, to ensure this never happens again. Words are not enough. We must act." The internet erupted. Some praised the company for owning its mistakes. Others demanded more accountability. But the conversation had changed. It wasn't just about one man's experience anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt like the fight had been worth it. Elijah stepped into the terminal, the same airport, the same airline, but everything felt different. The tension he had braced himself for, the subtle hesitation from staff scanning his boarding pass, the quiet second-guessing of whether he truly belonged. It was gone. The woman at the check-in counter greeted him with a warm, professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. Welcome aboard. You're all set for first class. Let us know if you need anything." No hesitation, no scanning him twice, no assumption that he was in the wrong place. He nodded, thanking her, and made his way towards security. Even there, the energy had shifted. The TSA officers were direct but courteous, moving passengers along without the unnecessary scrutiny he had come to expect. The small things, the details that most people wouldn't notice, stood out to him. At the gate, another attendant checked his boarding pass, flashing a polite smile before gesturing toward the priority lane. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carter." Simple, professional, as it should have been all along. As he stepped onto the plane, he noticed the difference in the flight attendants as well. They moved efficiently, greeting passengers, assisting with luggage, ensuring everyone felt taken care of. He found his seat and settled in, stretching slightly as he glanced around. No Madison. She was gone, but the effect of what had happened that day still lingered in ways she probably never anticipated. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The biggest change wasn't just the company's policies, it was the people. The employees who had once moved through their routines without thinking now carried an awareness they hadn't before. The airline hadn't just been forced to acknowledge its flaws, it had been forced to confront them, to take responsibility, to do better, not because they wanted to at first, but because they had no choice. That pressure had turned into action, and action had turned into something real. Elijah glanced around the cabin, watching the other passengers settle in, completely unaware of how much had happened to get to this moment. He wasn't naive. He knew the world hadn't changed overnight. He knew that for every victory there were still battles to be fought. But this was progress. And sometimes that was enough. As the plane began to taxi, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. A message from Sophia sat at the top of his inbox, a simple subject line that made him chuckle. "You really did it." He clicked on it, reading her short but powerful message. The airline just released its internal report. Complaints about racial discrimination have dropped by 40% in the last 3 months. Training is working. People are speaking up. Thought you should know. He smiled, closing the email. Change didn't come easy. It never did. But it came. As the plane lifted into the sky, he stared out the window, watching the city shrink below him, remembering the moment Madison had torn up his ticket with absolute certainty that she held all the power in that moment. She didn't just rip up his ticket, she ripped up her own future. And she never even saw it coming. He turned away from the window, exhaling slowly before letting his gaze settle straight ahead, his expression unreadable but knowing. Now the only question was, who else needed to learn the lesson? Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines vibrate through his seat. This wasn't just about him. It never was. It was about every person who had been judged before they had the chance to prove themselves. About the countless moments of quiet discrimination that went unchecked because there were no cameras, no bystanders willing to speak up. He had the resources, the influence, and the platform to fight back. But not everyone did. That was why this mattered. That was why it couldn't stop here. Somewhere out there, another person was being dismissed, denied, disrespected, just because someone had decided they didn't belong. Maybe it was in a boardroom. Maybe it was at a job interview. Maybe it was in a classroom where a teacher expected less from them because of their name, their skin, their background. It wasn't always as loud as a ticket being ripped in half. Sometimes it was just a look, a hesitation, a door that never opened. But discrimination, no matter how subtle, always left its mark. The real question was, what would you do when it happened to you, when you saw it happening to someone else? Would you speak up, or would you stay silent? Everyone had a choice. Elijah opened his eyes, reaching for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen before he finally typed out a single message to Sophia. Let's make sure this conversation doesn't end here. Because this wasn't just his story. It was bigger than that. And now is your turn. What's your story of standing up against discrimination? Share it in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected.